Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first Westmead Research Hub commercialization webinar for the year. It's great to see you all there online. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the Darug people, the original custodians of the land on which I sit here today at Westmead, as well as the original custodians of the land that you are all watching this webinar from. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Westmead Research Hub is a 22-year-long collaboration of the entities on the Westmead precinct conducting medical research. We have 7 partners, and the Research Hub is central to coordinating collaborative projects that benefit all of our members and all of you out there. Where we can work together, we do work together. And one example here is on commercialization training, commercialization, upskilling opportunities, and webinars like this here today. So thank you all for joining in, and I hope you really enjoy it. I will be recording this webinar and making it available on the Hub website, on our Hub YouTube channel for anyone who misses it. Or if you can only stay for part of the webinar. So yeah, please feel free to share that with your colleagues once we are finished here today. All right, let's get started. So I'd love to welcome today Matt Boustred, the CEO of ResusRight and current PhD candidate in Biomedical Engineering at the University of Sydney, one of our partners, Research Hub partners, to deliver today's webinar. ResusRight was founded in 2020 with a mission to improve outcomes for infants that need resuscitation at birth through the creation of technology that empowers clinicians to deliver high quality care. Their research has since received funding from the Cerebral Palsy Alliance and other investors, allowing them to develop a resuscitation monitor. Matt will be describing his journey to date, exploring the tension between being an academic researcher and leading a business, detailing what ResusRight is currently doing and its long-term vision, as well as provide advice to scientists seeking to explore a similar path to that which Matt has taken. If anyone on this webinar today has any questions, we'd love to hear them, so please submit them in the chat function and Matt will answer them at the end of the webinar. Once again, please submit your questions. You know what they say at school, there's no such thing as a dumb question. So yeah, fire away. If you have that question, I'm sure there's someone else in the room who's thinking it as well. So, Matt, are you there?
I am. Hi, James.
Hi, beautiful. All right, Matt, I'm going to pin you to the screen so everyone can see you. And I'm going to go off camera and off mic and hand it over to you, Matt. So take it away.
Thanks, James. I'll just share my screen. And everyone should be able to see that. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. So as James said, I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of ResusRight. And I'm also an academic researcher at the University of Sydney, doing my PhD in neonatal intensive care medicine. So essentially looking at the different ways that we can improve our care of infants with a specific focus on medical devices. So this seminar is going to go a bit into the journey of ResusRight, sort of where the last few years of the journey, to a lesser extent my personal journey, some of the things we've learned along the way, and the aim hopefully is to sort of to give a bit of an insight into the journey and help some of you who might be thinking of doing a similar thing with sort of taking those initial steps. So as a bit of background, ResusRight was founded in early 2020, in March 2020, to commercialise research developed at the Westmead Hospital and the University of Sydney. So there was 4 founders, Dr. Mark Tracy and Dr. Murray Hinder, who are both researchers at Westmead. Mark is a neonatologist with 30 years of experience, and together they form a research group that's sort of been at the forefront of neonatal intensive care medicine and improving our knowledge of it for sort of the last 10 or so years. The other 2 founders were myself and Matt Crott. Both of us are biomedical engineers by training, and we both came out of the University of Sydney. So ResusRight as a company has a vision of a world in which no baby dies or is left with a preventable disability at birth, which is an ambitious vision, very ambitious, but this is sort of the way that we're looking to assist it in coming about is through our mission of empowering clinicians through meaningful innovation to ensure world-class care for every baby. So essentially developing technology to advance the gold standard of care and assist clinicians with their care of infants. The problem we're trying to solve is resuscitation is the most common emergency procedure at birth. So every year it affects 17,000 infants, around 17,000 infants in Australia and around 10 million globally. So that equates to around 5 to 10% of the infants that are born each year. Of these, incredibly, a million babies still die every year and another million are left with a preventable disability due to a lack of oxygen at birth. And on some estimations, at least 300,000 of these deaths could be prevented by more effective neonatal resuscitation around the world. So this 300,000 refers to improving the sort of consistency and availability of neonatal resuscitation training. And so it doesn't actually account for potential improvement in disability or death outcomes from more effective resuscitation in areas that training is already widely available. So that's essentially what we're trying to solve. As a bit of background, when an infant's born, they're born with their lungs filled with fluid. Most infants clear this fluid naturally by themselves through the process of crying and the pressure grading of that driving the fluid out of their lungs. But as I said, 5 to 10% of babies need a bit of help. And the way we do this is through positive pressure ventilation. So essentially providing manual breaths to the infant to establish that pressure gradient that drives the fluid out of their lungs so that they can become air-filled and then the infant can start to breathe for itself. And you can see a sort of a diagram of this process happening on the left. And then on the right, you can see some images of some preterm newborn rabbits with, you can see the lighter patches in the lung over the first few breaths, the lungs becoming air-filled and establishing that functional residual capacity. So this is really where neonatal resuscitation is needed. Unfortunately, the lungs of a preterm and even term infants are still very underdeveloped. And so they're very vulnerable to overventilation. They've got thicker airway walls, the alveoli, they've got underdeveloped alveoli, and they've got decreased surfactant, which is essentially the chemical that makes it easy for your lungs to expand. So each of these things mean that if resuscitation is poorly performed, then it's very easy to lead to cascading lung injury and cascading effects that lead to brain injury of varying degrees. And down the bottom there, you can see the development of mouse lungs as the mouse goes from sort of throughout its gestational period. Unfortunately, resuscitation is often not performed optimally, and there's a couple of reasons for this. So a big one is that mask leak is actually quite a large issue in resuscitation. It's common, as has been repeatedly demonstrated in delivery room studies. It's often large in magnitude and it's very difficult to diagnose. So this is when a clinician might be resuscitating an infant, but actually the air is leaking out the sides of the mask and they're unaware of this, which has the ability to compromise resuscitation, particularly amongst less experienced resuscitators. A secondary issue is that we need to be aware of is that excessive tidal volumes can actually also injure the lungs and lead to those cascading effects I talked about earlier that can lead to brain injury. Animal studies have repeatedly demonstrated that excessive tidal volume delivery has been linked to lung and brain injury. And delivery room studies and preclinical data have also shown that most clinicians actually underestimate tidal volumes when they're delivering them, which means that they have the potential to over-deliver volumes. Despite this sort of this body of research, monitoring is currently not recommended in the standards due to a lack of large-scale randomized controlled trials. So randomized controlled trials have shown that using a monitor, such as the ones we're developing, significantly reduces tidal volumes to appropriate levels and reduces leak. And as I said before, this is a trend towards lower chronic lung disease and brain injury. And actually a meta-analysis published earlier this year was the first sort of hard data that indicated a 35% reduction in brain injury in preterm infants that required resuscitation. So this is still an emerging area of research, and this is sort of one of the difficulties that we're dealing with in terms of getting our technology to market, is that it needs to align with that research strategy as well. So I'll quickly now show you a demo of the training monitor and the products. You can get an idea of what it is we're developing. So you can see the monitor there in orange with a face mask, baby mannequin in the background, and then the resuscitation device, which is currently used in delivery rooms already, the Neopuff, on the right of screen. So I'm starting to provide ventilation to the infant now. You can see immediately the resuscitation monitor shows orange or red, which means it identifies a mask seal. I've readjusted the mask, and now you can see it's displaying green, which means I've got a good mask seal, and now I can target the appropriate tidal volumes for the baby. So that's one of our prototype monitors. We are developing two products, the Juno training monitor, which is a non-clinically approved device, meaning it doesn't need to go through TGA approval. And then the Nemo clinical monitor, which is essentially taking the next step on the development of the technology of the Juno to then develop it specifically for the clinical environment and get it take it through clinical trials and get it certified by the TGA. Both of these monitors provide feedback on mask seal, volume delivery, and ventilatory rates so that clinicians can optimize resuscitation. We want both of them to be affordable so that they can be used not just by the most well-resourced centres, but by centres that don't have as much cash to spend on sort of the latest equipment. They're easy to use because resuscitation often is not performed by the most experienced neonatologist, but actually is often initiated by a midwife who might not have as much experience with the resuscitation process. And we've also developed them to be compatible with all existing resuscitation equipment. So in terms of the team, the founding team, Mark and Murray, as I talked about earlier, was sort of the foundational research team that initiated the project. So they have been doing neonatal research at Westmead for greater than 10 years. Both of them are on the Ventilator Expert Working Committee for the TGA, and their research has influenced both national and international guidelines. So as an example of this, in 2018, they published a study that found that 10 out of 20 models of the self-inflating bag they tested actually failed a composite pass criterion, which meant that they couldn't provide effective ventilation, which is a staggering finding given that some of the self-inflating bags were actually on New South Wales Health's approved brands list and in the system for purchase. And so as a result of this, New South Wales Health actually issued a safety notice, withdrew their contract with those two or three companies. And this has sort of had ramifications around the world as well, given that particularly in developing nations, those 10 models that failed are widely used. Matt and myself bring up then the operational team of the founders. Both of us have got a biomedical engineering background. Neither of us had any previous startup experience, although I had some sort of commercial experience at a corporate advisory firm. And we initially joined the project when it was just a project in 2018 and 2019, where we developed the first initial prototypes with research funding from the Cerebral Palsy Alliance that later led into the founding of the company. So the way that the founding of the company actually came about was quite serendipitous. So we were invited to join the remarkable Accelerator Program due to our association with Cerebral Palsy Alliance. And part of the requirements for joining the program was that we actually had to form a company, because then they invest for a certain percentage of the company to give you some seed capital to actually start to grow the company. So we went into the process with no idea of developing a company, with no startup experience, essentially no commercial experience. And we formed part of a cohort of I think it was 8 companies over a period of 4 months. And the purpose of an accelerator program is essentially to take you to change the trajectory of the company, or to accelerate the company, as it's called. But for us, it was foundational in giving us the knowledge to actually take the research forward. So over a period of 4 months, you're put through weekly seminars to sort of give you knowledge into the various spheres and aspects of building a company. You're put in touch with a huge network of people, not just advisors and investors, but potential team members and people with experience in all the different sort of aspects that you're trying to take on. And essentially, it's to build your knowledge of developing a company, so that you can then, at the end of the accelerator, take it forward, raise money, and actually have a greater chance of success than you otherwise would. So if I look at those key ingredients that sort of, I think, contributed to the success of us in those early days and actually being able to even get the company off the ground, I've boiled it down into sort of 4 key things. The first, as I said, which was very serendipitous, is we had a varied team skill set. So Mark and Murray came at the company with much more research experience. Mark with very deep domain knowledge and a great network of clinical contacts, whereas Matt and myself came at it with the biomedical engineering knowledge, the ability to actually build product, and then I had some financial literacy. And so sort of by chance, we had a founding team that covered all of those aspects, which, as I've later learned, is very critical, having that variety of experience in that sort of early stage team. I think the second thing that, as I said, was foundational for us was the Accelerator Program. And I'd highly recommend this for anyone who's thinking of getting into this area. It not only builds out your knowledge of building a company and drastically increases your knowledge in the various areas outside of research, but it also gives you access to networks of people that can continue to help you. And this is sort of the gift that keeps giving, in that even up until now, although we went through the Accelerator Program 2 years ago now, we still go back to those same advisors and mentors for advice as we encounter the different milestones and sort of obstacles. I think the third thing was we had assistance with negotiating our IP and getting a license for that, which I think is quite, it can be an issue that trips people up sort of before they've even begun. And we were able to source an IP lawyer through our association with CSIRO who could represent us. And this is an interesting one, particularly for researchers, because you are associated with the research institution that you're trying to take the IP out of. But when you're developing a company, you also need to represent the company. And so you're actually on the other side of the negotiating table from the institution. And so having someone who's familiar with the process, who can represent you and give you the knowledge to actually negotiate a favorable IP deal, is critical for then signing on investors and getting the capital to grow the company. And then I think the final thing is that we had capital as well, through the grant that Mark was able to secure through CPA. That gave us the comfort and Matt and myself the ability to jump into the company and actually and research and fully immerse ourselves in that process, which increases your pace of learning and it increases your chances of success. And it also gave us the buffer to then raise further capital. So in terms of a snapshot of our journey to date, in March 2020, we founded the company, as I said, and we started the Accelerator Program in, I think, the beginning of April. That lasted for 4 months, when in August 2020, we graduated the Accelerator Program. It was at that stage that we sort of started looking at raising our seed round, mostly because that's sort of what everyone does at the end of an Accelerator Program. Although in our stage, as we learned throughout the process, we were too early stage to do so. But another learning in startups is sort of tackling things when you're slightly too early for them is always a good thing, because you learn things much quicker. So quickly, when we started to raise capital, we realized that we actually needed a license agreement negotiated with the university and signed before investors were willing to invest in the company. That took us about 4 months or 5 months to get from sort of beginning negotiations to finalizing, to going through the term sheet, to finalizing the IP negotiation, which we later found out was actually quite a good outcome. And we finalized that in January 2021 with UCID and Westmead. We raised a couple months later, raised our first seed round of 800,000, hired our first team member in April. And then we started looking at the grant landscape more thoroughly to see what non-dilutive funding we could use to take it forward. And we actually identified 2 grants that we were very well placed for. The BMTH, the Biomedical Horizons, and the Accelerating Commercialisation grant. So off the back of our conviction that we would be in a good shot to get both these grants, we went back to the same group of investors, and we actually raised more money, because for either of these grants, we would need matched funding, which essentially means that for us to get $1 of grant funding, we would need $1 of our own funding to match it. So we raised 425K in the second seed round, which took our total equity funding to 1.2 mil. And then in September 2021, we won the BMTH grant. And in December 2021, we won the Accelerating Commercialisation grant. And so that has given us funding now out for we gave us funding for the next 2 years, and now we're sort of a year into that. Then the final thing that's recently happened is in March 2022, we released our first product, which is the Juno training monitor. So it's the non-clinically approved product that I talked about earlier. So in terms of the milestones to date, we've now grown our team to 8 people, soon to be 9 in the middle of next month. We've raised 2.4 million in equity and grant programs, the 2 grant programs I talked about earlier. We've participated in 2 accelerator programs, not only remarkable, but then we've also participated in StartMate Accelerator, which was at the beginning of 2021. And then we made our first sales of the Juno training monitor earlier this month, which was very exciting. And we're going to a clinical pilot trial later this year at Westmead Hospital, actually, on 20 infants. So if I look back at our journey and sort of pick out some of the things I think we've done well over that time, I think the first one is that we had a powerful mission and vision. And this is something that was really hammered into us from the remarkable Accelerator program, which is all about finding your impact. And a mission and vision that's powerful and ambitious brings people on board with the journey. So not only investors, but also your team members. We've found it a lot easier to actually sell people on joining our team, because they can really commit to this mission and vision. Grant programs and just stakeholders in general. And so I think really defining that well and being ambitious is actually a good thing, rather than sort of trying to constrain yourself in that ambition. The second thing is that we've established a great network through the 2 accelerator programs we've been through, and also through Mark and the other clinicians we've been introduced to. And so that's across not only the clinical, which is so critical for actually getting the development of the product and pilot trials and driving research, but then also the commercial side, advisors, investors, and as I said earlier, this is sort of the gift that keeps on giving. In that the network is something you can always go back to and keep drawing on. The third thing is that we developed and communicated a convincing plan, and I think the narrative behind the company we've found, particularly in grant programs, is very critical in raising capital. So starting with that overarching, that high level mission and vision, but then the more detailed you can get with it, and the more you can anchor it in sort of reality in terms of numbers and demonstrate a feasible path to get where you need to go, the better position you're going to be able to raise capital and sort of set yourself on that path. And then I think the final thing is we're really lucky in being able to immerse in the journey. And we came onto the project when it was funded by the Cerebral Palsy Alliance, and because we've been able to keep it well funded, we've been able to immerse ourselves in the research and the company, which leads to a higher pace of learning and definitely increases your chances of success. Some learnings along the way. The first one is just around negotiating equity, which it's a thorny topic, I think, for anyone starting out, particularly for us and for anyone who hasn't done it before, because it's quite an awkward conversation. But equal doesn't mean equitable, and the sort of having the hard conversations earlier means that you don't need to have them later, and actually it's a lot easier for everyone. And the one thing I think that we learned is aligning equity with risk and commitment. So the people that are going to be more committed to the business and take greater risk in terms of starting the business, that's generally where sort of the greater bulk of the equity should go, because over the time period of 5 to 10 years of developing the company, they're the ones who are going to be sort of putting themselves on the line over that period to negotiate the obstacles and get it done. And obviously sort of experience and everything needs to be accounted for but ultimately the people who are going to be in the company sort of on the ground driving it forward is where sort of that bulk of the equity should go. The second thing is team is everything. So one thing, not just from our company, but from being in contact with other startups, your customers can change, your product can change, potentially your IP can change, but the one thing that's going to be constant throughout the process is going to be your team, and the people who are going to have to deal with those obstacles is going to be your team. And so finding people who are highly competent and great at what they do is so critical, and I think the number one thing in terms of companies being successful. The third thing is without a customer, you have nothing. I think this is an interesting, particularly for for researchers to wrap their heads around, because rather than sort of being IP focused and being research focused, you almost need to put yourself into the customer's shoes and think, well, where is the IP and the research actually going to be applicable? Because you need to find those people who are going to have the burning need that only your IP can solve, so that they're willing to work with you and potentially accept a less than perfect product, give input into the process, and make sure that you're developing something that solves a problem that people are actually willing to pay for, which is deceptively hard, I think, because there's a lot more things to work through than just the initial product, but you actually need to work through, the distribution and the sales process, the value propositions. And so finding those customers early is super important. And then the final thing is everything always takes longer and costs more. It's funny looking back at our seed stage when we raised money, and we were initially wanting to raise 250,000 to get our first product to market, which now looking back on it seems ridiculous. But at the time we were sort of fully convinced that we costed everything out, and that's what it was going to take us to get our initial product to market. The first sort of reality check for us was negotiating IP with the university and with Westmead, just because the process takes, by virtue of the process, takes a while. And being able to recognize that means that you're not going to be caught out by not raising enough money or not allocating enough time to actually hit those key milestones. In terms of sort of a brief look at our future roadmap, so We in October of this year, we want to develop the next stage of our clinical prototype, and then raise shortly after that. So after we've completed our clinical trial and developed the next stage of the prototype, we want to finish V&V, the verification and validation process, by about a year later. And then a year after that, have finished our pre-market pivotal study, which is gathering the data that we need to get regulatory approval. And then sort of at the beginning of 2025, gain regulatory approval and launch in key markets. And so this is something that building this out and getting an understanding of exactly how long the V&V and pre-market pivotal study processes take has been a big learning for us as well. So just to quickly touch on, build out sort of the clinical pathway to market. So we've completed preclinical testing already, which includes bench testing, so just looking at the accuracy of the monitor, and then a mannequin study, which is essentially looking at clinicians in simulated resuscitations to see whether it improves resuscitation outcomes. Both of these, the data we collected from this was really positive. So the monitor led to a significant reduction in mask leak, and also improved tidal volumes to the mannequins. And it's also as accurate as sort of other commercial research equipment. So the next stage for us is the pilot study, which is evaluating safety outcomes in a small cohort of patients. Then we move on to the pre-market pivotal study, which is evaluating the initial claims needed for regulatory approval. So that's going to be that our monitor improves tidal volumes, improves mask leak, with the understanding that if it can do that, then other research already published sort of builds out the rest of the body of research to show that it would probably improve brain injury and sort of lung injury in infants. And then after we've reached the market, because it is much more difficult to do a study of this size, we do a post-market pivotal study, which is evaluating stronger claims. So that's looking at actually whether directly whether we reduce brain injury, lung injury like pneumothoraces or bronchopulmonary dysplasia in infants. So in terms of research and entrepreneurship, the one learning I've had throughout this process is that actually it is a very natural extension, although it's a very different skill set. So domain expertise, particularly in deep tech, is so critical in taking research to market. And the more embedded you can have that domain expertise in the team, the greater your chances of success. And so researchers who are actually able to take that next step and translate research, I think are going to become more and more increasingly in demand, and you can already see that playing out. You need a multidisciplinary team, but it's probably easier to find someone with that business experience if you're coming at it from a research background, or it is easy to find someone with business experience to sort of build out the team. And that's something that we've found with our team is we've been able to build out that multidisciplinary team, which really helps as you taking sort of the journey. The final thing is that research is still a critical part of the commercialization journey, and actually aligning your commercial strategy with that research strategy is fundamental. But it's more about translation. So rather than fundamental research, it's proving the commercial or health economic claims of your product or treatment, or stepping along the TGA pathway towards regulatory approval, so safety, and then looking at your sort of your pivotal studies. In terms of some of the differences that I've observed, I think one of the main ones is becoming comfortable with acting in uncertainty. So because research is all about taking bits of knowledge and sort of removing the uncertainty from it by publishing research, it can be difficult for researchers to then move into the business side of things, where you have to be comfortable making some decisions with that level of uncertainty. So in research, rather than having sort of every claim referenced and knowing exactly what the body of research says and sort of working off that, you need to be comfortable taking that step into the uncertain. And as part of that, I think defining your risk tolerance in different areas is really important. So what I mean by that is, for us, we've got a very, very low risk tolerance in terms of the safety of our device and in terms of our translational research. So before we go to a pilot study, we want to make absolutely sure that that we've sort of nailed down all the safety aspects and there's very, very low risk to the infants. However, we've got a much higher risk tolerance in terms of exploring a new market or in terms of R&D work. And so having the same risk tolerance across the whole of the business doesn't work, and explicitly recognizing that and defining it is a good part to get, is a good way to get comfortable with having that uncertainty in different areas of the business. The second thing I think is increased speed of execution. So rather than being comfortable with research taking a year or 2 years or 3 years to actually play out, business opportunities often require you to move quickly and get things out sometimes within the week, or if you're exploring a partnership and move at that much quicker pace, which is interesting in a deep tech business because again you have to balance that longer period of research that's playing out in the business with the faster speed of the business side of things. The third is thinking more commercially, so actually putting yourself in the shoes of potential customers and stakeholders and thinking about what are their problems rather than what's the IP that we have as a company. And then the final thing is just-in-time learning. So this has been something that's been interesting to get used to, but it's you might be learning something in the morning that you then need to apply in the afternoon. So for instance, learning about in terms of IP negotiations, equity versus royalty-based IP licenses in the morning, and then having to go to sort of a negotiation with Sydney Uni in the afternoon with our lawyer to try figure it out. In terms of some useful tips, I think that could help researchers with where to start in terms of exploring the idea of entrepreneurship. I think one of the first things would be establishing a value proposition for the research you've done. So just having to think about where could it actually be applied and where could it be useful. Where would your initial customers be, and who would be the people who with the most burning need for your IP? And thinking laterally with that helps. So it might not be people, for instance, the clinicians on the front line for us, but maybe going 2 steps up to the regulatory bodies or the, say, for instance, HEDI, who certifies clinicians in resuscitation. If our technology can plug into them and assist them with certifying clinicians, then there's potentially a more pressing value proposition a couple steps higher on the rungs rather than sort of at ground level. Second thing is talking to potential customers. And I think the sooner is the better with this, because it just needs to be about their problem rather than your solution. And the more time that you can actually get out there and talk to them, the more of an understanding you're going to have about the market landscape. So it doesn't even have to touch on any sensitive IP that you've developed, but you're just trying to understand, gain an understanding of exactly where the IP could actually be applied. The third thing would be writing a business plan, which is essentially the scaffold of the commercialization journey. And the biggest thing to emphasize with this is it's a living document. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's a place to start with investors and stakeholders. And as you increase your understanding of the potential business you might be able to create, you can start to fill this out more and bring it down into sort of hard numbers and potentially the cost of goods that you're going to be creating, or your sort of strategy for signing up early adopters and then going more towards the mass market. But at a beginning, it can just be your mission and vision, potentially some high-level value propositions and some market sizing. So with rule of thumb, if you look at, for instance, for us, there's 10 million babies resuscitated annually. If each one of those uses sort of a disposable device of $50, then that's sort of X amount. And that gives you a rule of thumb for then understanding whether you'd be able to get investment into the IP and into the business. And then I think the final thing is participating in an accelerator program. And I really can't understate how important these have been for us, just in terms of being a shortcut towards building out your understanding of the commercialization journey, and also introducing you to a whole lot of like-minded people who can help you along your journey as well. And there's a couple that, I mean, we did Remarkable Accelerator, and then also StartMate. That is if you have a company already, but I've highlighted a couple down there. So Cicada Innovations runs a whole lot of seminars and programs for if you're just a researcher rather than if you have a company, that can just be that very sort of base level broadening of understanding about the journey. And then also StartMate Founders Fellowship is another one where you can join as an individual rather than as a company. And so I think those are sort of the four main things I would say to any, if I was to tell myself a few years ago where to start, that's what I would want to hear, and I hope that that's useful for you all as well. But yeah, thank you for listening to the journey. I hope it's been helpful, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks Matt. That was excellent. I can hear myself in an echo. There we go, it's gone. Excellent presentation, Matt. That's great. Just encourage everyone to post your questions in the chat, and I'm assuming that you have the ability to do that. I've enabled the chat function. I'll just start with a few questions, Matt, if that's okay, that I had. Touching on your last point there around accelerator programs, I can see that you've taken ResusRight through a couple of different ones. What's the value of taking a couple of different accelerator programs, excuse me, over just one? Do you learn different things? Do you uncover different things about your business?
Yeah, we're at very different stages for each accelerator program. And so I think with the knowledge that you come into it with, you take different things out of the accelerator program and you get different value out of it. So for us, the initial accelerator program we did in Remarkable was about building out our knowledge and just getting that immersion in sort of the startup ecosystem, and very base level sort of building out our vision and mission and getting an idea of where we wanted to go. Whereas if you do an accelerator program later on in your journey, then it is more about sort of what the name suggests, which is accelerating you. So you might already have a few customers, but you are looking at sort of increasing that rate of growth and potentially setting yourself up for a next raise. So I think depending on the program and depending on the stage you're at when you go into it, you're going to get very different sort of learnings out of the experience.
Thanks. Another question, if I may. So I noticed on your slide, on one of your slides back there, you titled it "What We Did Well," and then your next slide wasn't what we did wrong, but it was what we learned, your learnings. So just the idea that there will be setbacks and failures, but you don't call them failures, call them learnings. So is that a big part of being an entrepreneur in medtech and biotech? The idea that you don't have to know everything, but you learn through failure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, every sort of failure is an opportunity to learn. One of the biggest sort of sayings that's around the sort of startup ecosystem is fail fast, which I think sort of encapsulates what you were just talking about. But I don't really like the idea of saying fail fast. I think it's more, coming from a research background, it's almost more testing hypotheses. And the quicker failing fast, or the quicker you can test hypotheses and sort of get to an answer or experiment, the more you increase your chances of success.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. I really like your company's vision of no baby dies. I can see on your website it's a couple more words before that and after that, but you've really distilled your vision for ResusRight down to 3 words, which I think is great. How do you go about people might not necessarily have a communications background or anything like that, but how do you go about kind of working? What is your vision for your company, and to be able to then use that to gain funding and supporters for your company?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first thing is sort of establishing. It's a workshop process. I don't think you can expect to get it right straight away. And that's part of. I think the first thing is going out and talking to as many potential, so identifying different areas that it might be applicable for. If you don't have any idea of sort of where it would be applied, and then going out and talking to customers and potential stakeholders, building out your understanding of sort of where it might be applicable. And then a good exercise we used in the Remarkable Accelerator Program, which, as I said, is all about impact, is the concept of sort of 1x, 10x, and 100x. So you think about, okay, well, what's sort of the 1x version of where my what my company's vision could be, which I mean for us might be sort of prevent sort of brain injury in infants that need resuscitation in Australia. And then you say, okay, well, how can I 10x that? And you maybe make it global, and then you 100x it, and you look, well, what's the most ambitious thing that we can sort of do with our technology? And then that sort of sets the North Star for what your company wants to achieve, and it gives you sort of the longer term vision around to set the roadmap out to try actually sort of achieve that.
Excellent. All right, I've got a question from the floor. It says, Matt, you touched on health economics. Are you able to comment a little further on what this is and what you need to take into consideration to make a convincing argument?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something we're actually working through at the moment. So I'm by no means sort of an expert on it, but there's sort of 2 different sides to what, and I'll speak from our experience. There's 2 different sides to what we're trying to prove out with the research that we're doing around the monitor. So the first is actually gathering the data that we need to get regulatory approval. And so at a minimum for us, that's really just proving that our device is safe to use on infants. And if we can prove that, then we'd be able to get regulatory approval. But then the other side of that is actually providing justification for why people should buy your device. And then that's the health economic side. And it's all about translating a health outcome into the economics of it, as the sort of name suggests. So if you can, as an example for us, if we can reduce the length of stay of a baby in the NICU by a day, and it costs $3,000 for that baby to be in the NICU for that day, then you could say a cost benefit of sort of a 3,000, which then shows where we might be able to price our device. And then the research is all about how do we actually prove that out? So that sort of provides the framework for the studies that you need to do to provide the data to prove out your health economic justification. If that makes sense.
It does. No, that was very clear. All right. Okay, I've got one last question before we maybe wrap it up. So are you able to comment, Matt, on the utility of your device in an under-resourced environment such as those observed in poorer nations?
Yes, it's been one of our big focuses as a company, and that's part of the vision that we've got is that our technology is always going to be applicable for those developing countries. But through the process, we have learned, and there are obvious big differences and substantial differences between the health systems of a country like Australia versus developing nations. And so one of our design and sort of development philosophies has always been to make the device as affordable as possible and as easy to use as possible, specifically so it's going to be applicable for those developing countries. But our first target is developed healthcare systems, because that's what we know best, and that's where we've got the contacts and sort of where we're going to be doing the research. So the idea is that we develop our device for healthcare systems like Australia, the US, UK, and then that development cost is then subsidizes the device for developing nations. So because 99% of neonatal deaths happen in developing countries. So the objective for us has always been to get it to those developing countries, but the route we've chosen to do so is to sort of go developed healthcare systems and then take the technology onto developing.
I mean, it's incredible that you factor that into your business model, and that's that's really great to hear. David has said, fantastic presentation, Matt, phenomenal product and vision. All the best. And I think maybe we'll leave it at that, because I think we'd all agree that, Matt, that was a fantastic presentation. I loved it. And yeah, your product is phenomenal. We all would love to support you and your journey through this. And thank you so much for teaching this group, and whoever watches this webinar on demand after the fact, your journey. I think we've learned a lot from that. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, Matt, how do they do that?
Yeah, so my email address is matt.b@resusright.com. And yeah, more than happy to sort of to tee up a time to chat with anyone who's keen to hear more and share some knowledge.
Excellent, very good. All right, thanks, Matt. And before we wrap up, I just want to share some information about the next Hub Commercialization Training Seminar. So let me just share my deck. Everybody, please bear with me. Here we go. Sharing now. Hoping you can see this any second. All right. So at the end of these, we always encourage you, if you have intellectual property, if you you think you might be sitting on, if you have any ideas or thoughts or questions, please engage your Hub commercialization staff. So we have a commercialization page on the Hub website. So if you go to westmead.org.au and the research tab, research commercialization, you'll be able to see all of the commercialization team that support your institution. Go down to your representative, click the link to their email and get in touch with them, please. It's really important to secure your IP early and have that conversation with your commercialization staff. And lastly, I'd just like to let you all know that the next webinar is not on the 26th of May. I think it's in June. 2nd of June, not sure why it says 26th of May there, 2nd of June. And it will feature Kathy Connell, Senior Director, External Innovation Partnering from Johnson & Johnson on partnering with a pharmaceutical company. So that's going to be a really exciting webinar. The details for that will go on the Westmead Research Hub website under the Events tab. So please click that, find out more information, register for that webinar, and it should be a cracker. Thanks again to Matt. Thanks to everyone else for joining today. Have a great Thursday, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.